no comment about.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and I'm very honored to introduce Asad Haider, who's an editor of Viewpoint, which is one of the most compulsively readable and relevant magazines presently available. I'm sure many of you are familiar with things they've published because they're so compelling. Jaleh Mansour, who's a historian of modern and contemporary cultural production, who recently wrote Marshall Plan Modernism, Italian Post-War Abstraction and the Beginnings of Autonomia, which is an amazing book. And Jason Reed, who's written two very important books, The Micropolitics of Capital and The Politics of Trans-Individuality more recently. Okay, so I thought we'd begin this discussion of reproduction struggles. And I mean, one of the things that's been on my mind is the way that it seems like in the contemporary era, there's a decline of class consciousness and something of a lack of struggle within the workplace, a lack of the more traditional struggles against capital by the working class. And in its place, I mean, but that doesn't mean nothing's happening, right? In its place, there's things happening in like Baltimore and Ferguson and Standing Rock and the Women's March and the Women's Strike, and things that are happening really more around gender issues and around anti-racism. And of course, there's a kind of traditional answer to say, oh, this is about new social movements or identity politics or something, but those answers are unsatisfying, right? So one of the things that I'd like to think about is like how to think about those things from a perspective that includes the mode of production and that includes the role of capital in our lives.
Okay, so there's this idea that's commonly associated with a socialist Marxist perspective on organizing, which is of organizing at the point of production. And that's very sensible. It's very good to have organizing at the point of production and resistance to bosses and to capital at the point of production. Where does the idea come from, and why is it considered to be central? Well, you read Marx, if you read, for example, already in the Communist Manifesto, which is really a very early text in Marx's development, you find the idea that the reason why the working class is central and the reason why resistance at the point of production is central is that workers are being brought together into one homogeneous mass in a way that doesn't happen for any other sector of the population because of the nature of factory production. And therefore, they're already being organized by the organization of life that is capitalism. And so, by virtue of that, despite the fact that in capitalist society everybody is atomized, competitive with each other, the nature of factory production produces a unified agent, which is the source of resistance at the very center of capitalist society. So that's the idea that's set out, and it's elaborated in various ways. You'll find, for example, when Michael Hart talks about the chapter on cooperation, I'm sure he will point to this as well. The fact that when individual workers enter a factory and they have to work together in coordination with a machine, they form a new cooperative kind of subject. Okay, so this is the idea, and this is taken up by the German Social Democratic Party, and they put out a theory, the first socialist organization in history, late 19th century, and they developed this into the idea that, okay, capitalism is creating this working class which is ever more unified, ever more united around the same interests, and ever more organized into a collective unit. And that will be the basis for us to create a political party that can then intervene in the state. However, despite the fact that this was their theory, we find that when we look at the history of the German Social Democratic Party, the way they actually organize, the way they draw in members, is not from recruiting in the factory or through unions. They drew in members through activities in everyday life, through bicycle clubs, through food co-ops, the kinds of things that we laugh at in cities like this. But that was the basis of actually building a socialist party. These are activities that now we associate, as Andrew suggested, that we would list under social reproduction, something which appears to be outside of the point of production. But actually, it was the fundamental basis of recruitment and organizing and building a political organization. So when we talk about the idea that there is a historical change in the relationship between the point of production and what is outside of it, we have to remain attentive to the fact that they have never been opposed, even in the most classical forms of Marxist practice. They've always existed in a complex organizational relationship. That is the first point I would like to say.
Well, that's very content-rich and thorough, and I'm not at all certain that I would disagree, amend, qualify that in any other way than to continue to query why those two elements that were not historically contradictory have come to be contradictory. So if the site of production provided a core, and if that core no longer exists because of capital flight, what has then caused the kind of social dispersion and disarticulation that we claim to be suffering from collectively again and again and again? So struggle has dispersed. It's become so broadly distributed over a number of problems, questions, many of which have been revolving around identities in recent politics in the United States. So if we are, in reference to the previous comments, disarticulating the site of production from a kind of social space, then what explains the dispersal of struggle in contemporaneity, and why do we continue to romanticize the more unified, visible, coherent, integrated, representable struggles of yore that could have signs and signals of coherence, like unions or affiliations or even religions and communities? Now, why has that social stickiness evaporated? So the only thing I would add to that at a very abstract level is that we know that struggle is everywhere, but because of this quality of dispersion, it's as though it were invisible, because it doesn't collect or cohere in a way that becomes a mass movement. The only point of reference that I could have for this is what Sartre called the practico inert, where a number of struggles have come to a historical point where they kind of stymie one another's movement forward historically, but that's a debatable concept. But there are a number of movements, for instance, various forms of contemporary feminism, various forms of indigenous sovereignty, various forms of anarchist critique, various forms of Marxian critique. The problem is that we don't seem to have the kind of affective stickiness that would glue them together, much less move from discourse to action. So there are sort of two problems tracking parallel. Rather abstract.
Thanks. So I guess to kind of bring together some of the thoughts I've had since Philip first proposed this topic, and it really comes down to one question which has a tiny bit of wordplay in it, which I'll apologize for, and that is how to reproduce struggles over reproduction. And what I mean by that, just to kind of unpack that question a little bit, although I'm picking up on points that Assad and Jalal both, and Andrew all raised. The first thing is, and maybe we need to question this and qualify it, that what we were talking about in some sense involves struggles over social reproduction, whether it be social reproduction understood in terms of the necessary natural or biological conditions for life, Standing Rock, for example, where it's a question about people feeling like the very conditions of biological life, human life and non-human life is being threatened by modes of extraction of fracking or oil or whatever the case may be, or reproduction of a community continuing to be able to exist in the sense of Black Lives Matter, where reproduction is just you have zones which in some sense are kind of relegated outside the terrain of many forms of formal production, where people, aren't able to find jobs, aren't able to even be exploited, and are forced into forms of other forms of sustenance or ways of making a living, and their lives are in some sense directly threatened by police violence. Or in the case of the other figure that was given here, in the case of the Women's March, you have reproduction in terms of the more classical sense, in the Marxist sense of the reproduction of wage laborers, raising children, and the reproduction of the conditions that people may be able to sell their wage labor. And so, in some sense, asking the question, why are struggles of reproduction so difficult to reproduce? In the Marxist tradition, in some sense, that question is always already answered. Well, because reproduction, by definition, in a capitalist society is considered to be private, relegated to the home, not, as Assad pointed out, not having this degree zero of unification around the factory. And so, in some sense, it's always difficult, as in the case of like wages for housework and so on, to organize reproduction, because by definition, reproduction is kind of dispersed into multiple sites that are differentiated and not really brought together in a physical or other sense. But I guess in asking this question, I'm also trying to get at this strong sense that it seems to me that we constantly have seen these sort of flashpoints in resistance to capital, flashpoints that are very much permeated by this question of like, how can we make this continue? I mean, I don't know if people were involved in various forms of Occupy, and one of the things that really struck me in both Occupy Wall Street in New York and the Occupy in Maine, where I live, is there was a strong sense of wanting to stay in the camp, stay in the occupation, just because people didn't know how to organize if they went home. Like, if they went home, they felt like the entire struggle would end, not just the attachment to the camp as a form of struggle. It was this sense of like, we need to be here because we don't know, or we need to figure out how to organize. And this, or another more pervasive sense, before Occupy, anyone who participated in one of the large, anti-war or whatever marches, there's this bizarre sense of like, you go to this huge thing and everyone marches and does whatever, and there's this sense like, all these people are here, and shouldn't we like, hey, what are you guys doing next Saturday? Shouldn't we like figure out some way to like continue this? And it sort of just dissipates, right? And that dissipative moment, or it kind of lingers on in a sort of cultural sensibility, as we've seen, where things start as a movement and they get reduced to a hashtag. And I think the question that I'm trying to think through is, given that these things are so pervasive and the flashpoints have begun to sketch out a kind of smoke that suggests a fire, how to kindle that fire and how to reproduce these struggles over reproduction. So that's the question that I'm trying to work with and throw out as a provocation.
It occurs to me that maybe we can talk about Italy in the 1970s, and that is maybe an earlier paradigm of obviously a struggle that didn't go where we would have wanted it to go, but that maybe kind of resonates with our current era, and that we could maybe reflect on as a time in which struggles that were both reproductive and around production maybe communicated perhaps better than now, and what we can maybe translate from that period.
What we could translate from the 1970s to the present.
Okay. So what I tried to suggest previously is that there was a very compelling gesture in Marxist theory, which was to say, let's identify what will be the unified political agent that's already being created in the heart of capitalist society by its own tendencies, that is, gathering people together into a sort of working class that isn't differentiated by particular skills or particular social groupings, traditions, and so on, and to subject everyone to the same factory regime, which is at the core of the accumulation that drives the whole society. You have the potential for a revolutionary agent right there at the center. That's a very compelling argument, and it's not one that, you wouldn't want to say, okay, who is the most oppressed and who has the most important demands and what do we think is the most important thing to happen right now at a moral level or something like that. This was a different kind of analysis. It was a strategic analysis which says what's at the center of this society's developmental patterns and what is already forming an antagonistic force. Okay, as I suggested, the problem was that when you looked at the way that these organizations actually came together, it was not automatic. Okay, there is an independent kind of political level at which people had to work in order to create organizations that then would be able to turn this potential revolutionary force into one that was actually active. And that was what happened through the various cultural initiatives of the Social Democratic Party, through its political organizing and so on. The interesting thing in 1960s Europe, you can see this tendency in the US earlier, probably 30s, 40s, and in the 50s and 60s in Europe, is that suddenly you get so many people crowding into factories and such an advanced level of capitalist accumulation, such a great need for workers, that spontaneous rebellions suddenly take on this massive and extremely disruptive force. Okay, so in Italy, workers in the auto factories are engaging in constant rebellions without the approval of the union and so on, and that creates a completely overwhelming threat to the continuation of the capitalist system in Italy. What happens in the 70s is a fundamental problem. Once you get a capitalist crisis, conditions for accumulation are not thriving the way they were in the post-war boom, which is the most prosperous period in the history of capitalism. When you get a lower demand for workers, suddenly it becomes difficult to go out on strike because you'll simply be fired and someone else who is looking for a job will be put in your place. So the centrality of the factory, what the Italian workers at the time called the centrality of the factory, is declining. Now it becomes essential for these communist militants to say, what can we find outside of the factory that will be a revolutionary force? And how will it be organized? How can we talk about collective organization and party organization in this way? Now, one of the very interesting theoretical developments that's happening at this point is that feminists who are in the communist movement are saying, well, look, half of the working class was not in the factory. The men were going to the factory, but they could only go to the factory because they would come home and we would cook and we would have children and those children will grow up and go to the factory. Okay, that was what they called social reproduction. That was this particular analysis, which showed that what we conceive of as the working class goes far beyond this image that is fixed in capitalist society of a male white factory worker or whatever. When we talk about class struggle, there's this idea that class and identity or class or whatever other category are opposed because class equals the white male worker. Well, the feminists in Italy in the 70s are pointing out, no, class struggle is the struggle of women who are forced to do housework in order to have a husband who can receive a wage that they can live on. So this, in the 1970s in Italy, it was an expansion of the idea of class, of what class meant and what class struggle could be.
If I could just add to what Assad is saying, that's precisely the problem with intersectionality, which is a mode of critique and analysis that would suggest that struggles are at an intersection rather than mutually constitutive. So, for example, the kind of dominant paradigm in various forms of feminism and post-colonial theory that indigenous sovereignty is one problem set, and labor history and the problem of a struggle in the sort of classical problem that Jason is pointing to is a separate problem, whereas the sort of, going back to a discussion for those of you who were there from last night, the problem seems to be the need for some way of reimagining a totality now that that totality is no longer presenting itself. And then the question becomes, do we all sort of sit around and wait for the moment when that moment makes itself evident, or do we try to, however artificially, come up with tactics and strategies to sort of stoke that fire, energy, kind of social passion that seemed to affix in the Occupy moment? But to return to my first point, part of my project, in any case, is thinking through the impasses that have beset theoretical discourses and political praxes to try and come up with a way of imagining that affective stickiness that I brought up previously, where struggles wouldn't be perceived as so intersectional, but rather as somehow mutually determined and knotted together on some other, maybe social sphere or place of the imagination. I don't even know where to locate it, where we're not seeing the kind of core that has seemingly been displaced.
Yeah. So I guess a couple things in terms of thinking this, connecting this dot between the 70s in Italy and now. I mean, the one is, you know, a lot has changed about this division which we've been talking about between reproduction and production. A division which in some sense isn't really a division, but is often two sides of the same process, two aspects of the same social factory, to use that term, right, in which the social factory as a term means that as much as the factory is a site of production, the factory doesn't exist without the home as a site of reproduction, which is a necessary component of the factory. So the social factory means you include the factory, the houses, and everything that plugs back into it. And even that, which is an important theoretical and political development, needs to be sort of historicized, and we need to think through what is happening in the social factory now, in the sense that not only are people continuing to do all the sort of necessary tasks of social reproduction in terms of raising kids, cleaning houses, and so on, there's also all these new strange sort of forms of exploitation that are coming into existence, in which people are, you know, taking that unused room and, you know, posting it on Airbnb because they need to do that because wages are declining and otherwise they can't afford to live in the city anymore. Or they need to take that car that's sitting there in the driveway, you know, when they get home from work, and drive it around for a couple more hours just to be able to continue to pay the mortgage and so on and so forth. So fears of social reproduction have become sort of incorporated more and more. And so a lot of people are even questioning whether or not we can talk about a division between reproduction and production anymore. And that's one important, I think, insight. I think another important insight in terms of thinking through this connection, and I'm thinking this because we're in what, the Temple of Labor? Is that what this place is called? Labor Temple. One of the other things that was an integral part of some of the 70s in Italy was the refusal of work. And this idea that people didn't want to struggle so that work could be better paid, which is an important struggle, obviously, but they wanted to liberate life from work itself. And in some sense, you know, a lot of the political movements of apparismo and autonomia in the 60s and 70s saw themselves at odds with what they saw as a tradition within socialist and communist parties in which work itself is valorized as a true creator of wealth and so on. They wanted to liberate life from work. Well, that demand, you know, takes on a very interesting valence in our current historical conjuncture. Where on the one hand, we have, I think, two processes that I think need to be talked about. One is that people who find themselves in contemporary forms of production often feel all the regular aspects of alienation. They're not in control of what they do and how they do. But there's almost this new level of alienation in which, and I'm thinking of, and I can't remember the title right now, but a book I read not too long ago, Working Down the Line, Jamie Woodcock's book about trying to organize a call center, which the first version of appeared in Viewpoint. And one of the things that's, when he was trying to organize a call center in the UK, one of the things that really struck him when he talked to his fellow workers is how much, first of all, they were absolutely perplexed that anyone would come to a call center on purpose, right? That he could have had other options, because this is the lowest of the low, the bottom part of the economy, right? A job that you show up in, and the first thought you have when you get there is like, how am I going to get out of this job and do some other job, right? High turnover, high dissatisfaction, and so forth. But also the sense that, like, as he says, like, the strong sense that people felt like in a just world, their job wouldn't even need to exist, right? I mean, it's different between being sort of exploited as, you know, someone working in an auto factory or a farm, where on some level, the work is terrible and what you're forced to do and how you're forced to do it is all terrible. But on some level, you can feel a kind of utility of like, well, this thing needs to happen. Food needs to be grown. Things need to be repaired. Selling, you know, credit cards to people who don't need them and don't want them, you know, there's a different level of a kind of expenditure. So that's one thing that's happening. The sense of I mean, not to go along with his entire interpretation, what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, right? And then coupled with that, we have this strange valorization of work from the side of capital itself, right? What do we call capitalists nowadays? We call them job creators. And that's supposed to be a justification of their very existence. They create jobs. And so the level of ideology, right? Work is so often being claimed by the very people who are exploiting work. So what it seems to me is interesting in terms of thinking about new ways of articulating and bringing together disparate struggles is that what used to be seen as a kind of ultra-left sort of fringe, the refusal of work, I think it's becoming more and more part of the center of anti-capitalism in the sense that either people don't have work, or the work they have is demeaning in its very kind of irrelevance for any vision people might have of what they want to be doing with their time, coupled with the fact that work itself has been so elevated into this category of kind of moral standing and this strange like right workerism is what I'm calling this moment. Anyways, it's another. I'm just sort of throwing out some dots and trying to connect them. But yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Right work. Okay. There's something I wanted to ask about since the social factory has come up, which I think is it's from Mario Tronti originally, but then developed by a lot of other Italian workerists and autonomists. And it's something I've wondered about for a long time, and I was hoping that you could help me and us think about. Okay, so for a lot of the Italian feminists, they take the position that domestic labor is directly bound to commodity production, that in a way the factory has extended throughout capitalist society such that their husbands are kind of middle managers and they're workers too, right? They're participating in capitalist production. And that's a very powerful kind of idea that they have. However, it's also, and it's evocative, right? But it's also controversial because in other ways, like strictly speaking, they're not really making commodities. They're part of they're an adjunct to the production of capital, right? But not directly pulled into those circuits. Or at least that's the argument Lisa Vogel makes, drawing on Althusser, right? Where she says, you can say capitalism is the dominant mode of production. That doesn't mean all the work in society is about producing value for capital, right? Some of that work might be governed by different rules as kind of it's a necessary adjunct, certainly, for producing commodities, right? It's used by capitalism, but it's not commodity production as such, right? So that question has been honestly something that's puzzled me for years, and I was wondering since there's this question of what do we do with reproduction struggles, how committed are we to the idea that these struggles are like directly fighting capital, like fighting over reproduction as a worker's struggle, versus the idea of, well, no, it's certainly going to confront capital, but it's not necessarily like a struggle within production as such.
I kind of like the interpretation of the Italian feminist analysis of social reproduction offered by Endnotes, which takes emphasis off of the problem of reification, which I think Andrew is describing via Lisa Vogel, and puts the emphasis on the mediation of the wage, which allows us a much more specific target to think about the co-constitutive relationship between production and reproduction. The problem is that the wage system has evaporated, but the social structures that rested on it have not. And so that's why you have this, it is a kind of Tronti problem, where the cogs in the social factory break and reconnect at different points, and we don't have the analysis or the praxis to keep up with it. So that kind of, as Assad pointed out, that kind of centralized locus of production has been displaced, but we have all of these sedimented social forms that aren't finding motivation for a new, it's the old world is dying and the new world hasn't been reborn, and what the hell do we do? But the question seems to come down to two things again and again, which are, to quote, the invisible committee, how do we find each other? That's always the first problem. And how do we survive? We know that the ship is sinking, so the next question is what do we do about it? But I just think that question of reification versus wage mediation is one way of getting a sort of more specific description of how those chains have come to be disarticulated, and why we find ourselves in this kind of social freefall. It's an ancient, at least, the 19th century sociologists just called it atomization, or, that old problem. But what is it about atomization now that's different and specific, which goes back to your question about what happens after 1973?
You're breaking up the order here. I think, just following off of what was just said, I think one of the other interesting things to think about in terms of connecting these dots from the 70s to now, one of the other interesting, I think, really strong points that of the Italian feminist critique, especially offered by people like Silvia Federici, is that not only, as we've been talking and discussing, not only is the work produced in the home, housework, reproductive labor, integral to the capitalist economy, it's integral that it not appear as such, right? That it appear to be work that is done not for a wage, but done out of affection, love, care, etc., and naturalize to the very people who do it, right? The housewife is a figure that not only performs work that is unwaged, but it's seen to almost exude from her very body and person, right? Because that's just what one does. I always think my own personal, experience in terms of, I had to go back to my grandparents to find a traditional housewife, but I remember visiting my grandparents, and there was always this smoked glass cake box, and it was always filled with something like cake or cookies or something. I never saw those things being made, but they were always there when I went to visit my grandparents. It's this invisible labor that was just sort of part of her idea about what it meant to be a caring mother or grandmother, was that this thing was always filled, right? And thus always kind of neglected because it was always filled. But anyways, enough of that. It's this reification, right? The sense that something is seen not as something learned. You have to learn how to cook, you have to learn how to clean, and not as something that's socially produced, but as something that comes out of one's very being. I mean, one of the interesting questions we can ask, and sort of trying to historicize our difference, is like, what are the new lines of reification? What new forms of social practices are being represented now, not as something learned, developed, and cultivated, but as something given in there? And I think there we have to look at the way in which our contemporary forms of labor often demand of us not only a particular kind of facility and ease with forms of social media, internet and social connection that we're always on, always engaged, but a certain way of constantly engaging and reinventing ourselves. Like, these have become the new, not the new housework in the sense, I'm not going in the sort of wages for Facebook direction and saying these things are directly productive, although they do produce revenue for Facebook at least. Well, that too. But that these are the new forms of things that are produced and demanded of us that are often taken for granted, right? I mean, I think Paulo Virno has a very interesting way of gauging this when he talks about the use of the word professional in the modern job interview. I mean, it used to be, there's a whole history where the professions used to be lawyers, doctors, educators, those people who had skill and training in what they do. And that's kind of been not so much replaced, but more or less effaced by this constant demand that one must have a professional demeanor has become the new demand of the job interview. And which is sort of disconnected from any specific skill, right? A professional demeanor doesn't mean you act like a doctor or a lawyer. It means you conduct yourself in a very particular kind of way, in a very contradictory kind of way. I mean, the interesting thing about the demand to be professional is that it demands, I think, two things at once, right? It demands a very strong identification with one's work, right? To be professional is to not sort of like clock out and be like, I'm done, man. That was like 50, I'm on break. Why are you even talking to me? Or it's to be constantly attuned to your work, but at the same time, constantly attuned in this vaguely kind of indifferent way, right? Because it's not professional to like yell at someone or get emotional or whatever. So you're demanded to be sort of abstractly engaged at once, right? And that's sort of disseminated, right? Everyone's supposed to be professional, no matter how slight the wages are attached to that. And these forms of ways of comporting ourselves, ways of acting and inhabiting the world, have become the new reification. Right? And by that I simply mean these things are produced, they're demanded of us, they're not natural, they're historically produced, but it's very important that they're taken for granted or appear as natural. And these, like housework, are part of the new lines of struggle, right? You see this everywhere, where people are demanding or wanting things like they want the right not to answer a work email after a certain time, right? They want the right to disassociate themselves from these forms of communication, dissociate themselves from these forms of behavior, want to not be professional. I want to know what they are outside of this professional persona we all have to manufacture for ourselves.
Okay, so I will say that, Andrew raises a very significant, very interesting kind of scholastic question. It's like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's a question about the categories of value and the way we understand their application to different forms of labor. For some people, this is very important. You may have heard from them in previous weeks. I believe that the importance is somewhat exaggerated. So the question is, and we could draw diagrams and so on, whether the labor of a woman working at home produces value in the way that the labor of presumably her husband who is going to the factory and generating a widget, that generates value. Do they both generate value? Well, you know, I mean, already we've posed the question in a very strange way, as though it were not the case that, for example, when Marx was writing Capital, that the vast majority of the working class that he was describing was women. At the initial stages of industrialization in the textile industry and so on, you have enormous amounts of women engaged in the labor force. That was not true for a very limited period in history, really in the post-war boom, when there were particular ideologies of the family. You remember that there was a huge effort during the Second World War to get women into factories because men were all off fighting. And then they came back and there was this whole idea, oh, we've got this great family structure, traditional family, woman's going to stay home now. That was new, right? And I think that the usefulness of talking in terms of social reproduction is that we don't need to get into this sort of pseudo-mathematical discussion of what produces value as though that would tell us in some magical way what is most politically important. What we mean by social reproduction at a very fundamental level is, how is it that the social relations of a particular kind of society continue to exist every damn day? You know, there's the idea that you get if you take an economics class or something like that, that it's just completely natural, self-evident, that we would trade things with each other in order to survive. It's not self-evident. It's very strange. If you were to take a peasant in a feudal society and say to him, no, the potatoes you just grew, don't eat them. Sell them to me, okay? And then tomorrow I will sell you French fries. No, it makes no sense. You grow them, you eat them. Okay? It's a new kind of system. It's a very unusual kind of system. How is it that it emerged and then continued to exist, not only in a limited sense, but on an ever-expanding scale so as to encompass an entire world? That is the question of social reproduction in a very basic sense. How does that form of society continue to exist? And so we don't need to know what is specifically value productive in order to talk about this. We just need to look and see what are the various social practices that perpetuate these relations, the relations in which we are separated from our means of subsistence and dependent on the market for survival. So that, I think, is the fundamental significance of this term. And we'll find now, I mean, casting it in this wider kind of framework, the problem of domestic labor. Okay, it was discussed in this particular Marxist feminist discourse in terms of reproducing the labor power of the male worker. Well, we also know that domestic labor is waged. Enormous amounts of people do wage domestic labor, okay? That totally changes the categories. And in recent years, there have been many initiatives to organize domestic workers. There was a Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, the formation of a domestic workers' union, and that had to deal with the very specific workplace conditions of domestic workers. It wasn't because they were excluded from a wage. They work for wages, but they still have different conditions. They don't have one workplace together. They go and work in other people's homes, okay? How do you organize in those conditions? That's the question that you have to ask actually about every form of labor and every social practice. What is the specific way to organize in a strategic manner?
So then it is about the problem of reification in the expanded field. The trouble is that while we collect at one site and try and solve the problem or address the problem at one nodal point, capital is striking back at another nodal point. So there's an especially interesting pamphlet that's available at the table in the back of the room, Communization and the Abolition of Gender. It's an excellent piece of writing. It's wonderful. The issue there is that one would think, from an Italian feminist perspective, that the abolition of gender would be something like a sex strike, right? Where if you strike at the source of social reproduction, it'll sort of ripple vertically and horizontally through the social field and bring capital down. The problem is that capital strikes back by feminizing labor. So you can have the abolition of gender and still have this kind of set of gendered wage relations outside of gender. So there's this kind of strange set of mutations that are always happening.
No, I mean, this has been great. I think this is probably a good time to open it up to some Q&A from the audience. I'm sure people have things they'd like to talk about.
Well, one of the things, I guess I think we're on the precipice of a real instability with regards to conditions of labor and life. I think we're about to have massive numbers of surplus populations, according to many discussions, and sometimes I think that the only rational future plan that current top capitalists must be thinking is like Las Vegas condos on Mars to like gentrify elsewhere and it's just part of the process going forward. So anyway, that's and I guess also I think it's important to look at wage, as wage has to do with time and money, and you can reverse that equation to talk about time. And so as society is surplused, and but we've filled our time with these other roles. This description that you had of that basically we've leisurified labor to be dispassionate and just sitting and, when we work in a software company, we're able to goof off all the time. But that's not going to, very soon, even the bullshit jobs, like the cost of maintaining populations that could cause trouble, when that isn't working, I just wonder if your arguments, your discussion, historical discussion is ready to go to the next step. I'll just leave that image, I guess.
Should we take a few?
We'll take a few.
Let's do 3 minutes of 3.
Thank you for your time and thoughts. Just at the end there, what you were describing is the feminization of labor, I believe is what you said, even as gender is sort of like challenged and abolished even. Maybe a lot of people knew what you were referring to, but I was wanting to hear more. If you could just talk more about what you're talking about, the feminization of work and labor.
I have 2 questions, actually. I'm Andrea with the Freedom Socialist Party. We're a socialist feminist party, and we have always tried to combine the classical, traditional labor struggles with what's important to women and people of color and immigrants and LGBTQ people. My questions are, how important do you, CWA is on strike, right? Today, tomorrow, and Sunday, CWA is on strike against AT&T. I wonder how important you see traditional labor struggles, and also, do you see successful examples of bringing together more traditional workplace-based struggles with social struggles and community struggles?
It seems like Jason, yours is the first question and mine the second, perhaps.
Sure, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that occurs to me is that on the one hand, thinking in terms of reproduction or social reproduction allows us to bring together a lot of things that are otherwise disparate in terms of bringing together factories or places of work and private places, bring together discussions of gender with discussions of class. But there's almost a risk, I think, that in some sense, the phrase reproduction, it almost does too much, because then we add to that we're not just talking about reproduction in the sense of biological reproduction. We're also talking about, as Assad pointed out, we're talking about the reproduction of practices of particular social relations, and we're all doing this in the context of a form of capital which seems, in some sense, very unconcerned with the reproduction of its own very conditions, right? It seems to be kind of perpetually undermining itself on so many different levels. You can see this in various different fields. I mean, as someone who comes out of academia, right? Academia has spent years now not really being concerned with reproducing its own conditions, right? Because there's this brief period where, okay, you had more people coming out of graduate programs, you could turn them into adjunct laborers, it's cheaper and so on. But now that's beginning to undermine the entire functioning of the institution. Similarly, I mean, I always think that a clear way to get at the non-reproducibility of particular forms of capitalist accumulation is, to take just an easy example, almost everyone who drives for Uber bought their car when they had a different job than driving for Uber. And Uber, in some sense, is trying to deal with this because they're going to move into the car loan business. So you can pretty much, be driving Uber to pay off your car loan, which is almost like going back to like working in the mine to get company script. You could pay in the company store. And I believe Amazon is doing some of the same things with their Mechanical Turk right now. You can work Mechanical Turk for store credit. And so there's a certain sense in which these things are seen as, in some sense, the very cutting edge of capital, seem to almost have hardwired into them the fact that they have no future, right? They can sort of build off of a moment of kind of surplus and sort of extract everything from that. And this non-reproducibility is everywhere, in the sense that, I mean, when you read stories about cuts that are being made to pensions, retirement funds, etc., globally, there's a strong sense you get from the ruling class that, like, this sense that they can squeeze more and more, and people will somehow make do, right? People will somehow make do. And I think that squeezing is very much without a future. And at some point, people aren't going to be able to make do, and at some point, that is going to come back. So here, I think we're at a sort of impasse that forces us to conceptualize new terminology, in the sense that we're trying to think struggles around social reproduction in an age of the non-reproducibility of our historical condition. And that non-reproducibility is everything from the non-reproducibility, I mean, that's what we mean by the Anthropocene, the non-reproducibility of the metabolic rift, the biological conditions of our existence, right? This can't keep going on. And so that's the moment we're in, and I think there we need to kind of like sift out these different senses of reproduction of existence, reproduction of social relations, and the reproducibility of modes of exploitation, and maybe need throw a few more words in that. Because as much as social reproduction becomes the dense thing that brings everything together, it also is layered with multiple conflicts and contradictions.
Yeah, I just intervene on that. I mean, that seems to me also to suggest that there's a non-scholastic way of investigating value to try to think in terms of how capital or anything can't reproduce itself if it continues, like you say, in some of these particular processes that's engaged in. So that it's not a question of doing this crazy mathematics where you're setting out, you know, S minus V, T sort of stuff, but really asking, again, the question in a more general way, what needs to keep happening for capital to even keep doing what it is? Obviously, reproduction counts in that, and obviously some other things, job creation doesn't. You know, and you're coming up with, I think, a sort of a value theory. You're trying to come up with a vernacular value theory rather than a scholastic one, I would just say.
Well, the feminization of labor is first and foremost a piece of language. So I would like to remind all of us of that. It's a piece of language that is trying to be descriptive of a change in the modalities of labor. So rather than the kind of the degree zero source of value production that Assad brought up in the first segment of this program, there used to be such a thing as factory work, where one household worker could work at that factory and sustain the life of a family. Okay, that has evaporated. That has been displaced. Capital flight, et cetera, et cetera. What is meant by feminization is the replacement of that by any number of other kinds of forms of work that seem to be about delivering services and affect. And those are being described as feminized. They're more flexible, they're more dispersed, they're not necessarily 40 hours a week. They might, you know, I'm not attempting to collapse it with the example of Amazon's Mechanical Turk, but there's a kind of strange zone of indistinction between what is being called feminized labor and that outer limit. I hope that answers the question. It's trying to be descriptive.
Anybody else want to get on line here? Do you want to answer some of the other
We'll hear his question first. I'll hear his question first.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This has been really interesting. The question of bringing workers together in unity, I think, was one of the first things you raised, and I think the other side of that was that Marx stressed that that's where the real power lay, right? Because workers at the point of production can cut off the flow of surplus value, profit, et cetera. And I think that's still true. We live. I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on how much things have changed. In the time of Marx, large sections of the working class in Britain did not produce value. They were domestic servants of rich people, right? So there's been a lot of shifts in the economy and all that, in the workforce and so forth. But the production of surplus value is still central to capital, and it's still the place where the real strongest power lies. That doesn't solve the problem, but it does show where the real power is. And if the working class is to become unified, it has to take up questions of oppression. So it's not like these are separate or aside or anything like that. If Marx talked about slavery, he talked about the Irish workers and the English workers and all that. The divisions within the working class have been there forever, and they have to be, to the extent that they're not overcome, it weakens the power of the working class at the point of production and other places. So the question of exploitation and oppression are directly connected, and but still today, ultimately, we can't avoid the question of going back to the point where workers at the point of production are organized, where they have the real power. It's not an easy job, but it's not something that can be avoided either in the long run.
So I think it's a very important point that it's possible to exaggerate how much has changed. And it's also certainly there is a risk in abandoning a fundamental and strategic central site of struggle. I agree with that. I am not sure I'm not sure we can accept that the point of production has actually been strategically central in the contestation of the capitalist mode of production. We see throughout the 20th century all of the revolutions that were called communist were fundamentally based on peasant revolutions. We have seen that many of the major factory-based struggles throughout the 20th century had a very close relationship to social movements that were situated outside of the workplace. There are countless examples of this, especially starting in the 60s and 70s. The most significant mass movement in the 1960s that made some of the broadest changes that we've seen in this society, that was the civil rights movement, which was once again outside of the point of production, but which posed the possibility of forming connections, forming strategic connections between different sites, so that you could have a unified challenge to the entire system of capitalist domination. I think this connects to the previous question, which is that I think that the CWA strikes and any other strike that takes place now, they are very important. But I don't think they are important because of the strategic centrality of the point of production or because economic issues are more important than social issues or something like that. I believe they are important because of the centrality of mass movements and of the possibility of self-organization. That is what I would distinguish from other discourses like what we call identity politics now. What we call identity politics now, to me, has nothing to do with the mass movements of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and so on. These were movements from below which put an entire social structure into question. They were not about demanding the redress for injuries from the government. They were not about changing the appearance of the ruling class. I think the central question here is mass movements. And so, going back to the example of the civil rights movement, C.L.R. James said that the black struggles in the United States are independent struggles. They are not automatically part of the socialist movement. But the fact that they put into question a power structure which has excluded an entire portion of the population, the fact that they show the possibility that people can lead themselves and fight against this structure, that is the kind of thing that can cause a socialist revolution to take place. That basic initiative, the thrust of mass self-organization, is what, to me, is most significant and what really defines a communist politics.
I'm really curious about expanding on this discussion of affective labor, and particularly how young workers are trained to go into the workforce. I'm a teacher myself, and I'm thinking about this idea of professionalization. So I work with youth who would be considered what you call the surplus population. They're from communities that have been pushed out of the workforce, and they've been pushed out of school in many cases, and are being pushed into the school-to-prison pipeline. And there's all this pressure on us to very professionally train them to be professionals. And the assumption is that that's going to lead to a job, and often it doesn't. But like you said, they have to maintain it even with a very tenuous connection with the wage. And then I see the left and activist groups that I've been a part of operating in a very sort of professionalized way that seems very alienating to my students and to my friends and I, and a lot of people who are sort of tired of maintaining that professional facade. I'm wondering if you are aware of movements going on around the world or theoretical articulations of alternatives to that sort of professionalized activism in ways that might speak more to where working class and dispossessed folks are at affectively now, that might appeal more than this sort of professionalized activism.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I mean I think the history under which you get a kind of professionalized kind of left, I think there are multiple aspects of it. Some of it has to do with what Sai was saying about a certain version of identity politics that gets kind of rewritten into kind of respectability politics, right? The idea that it becomes necessary to create and cultivate people from various groups that can take their place amongst the ruling class by comporting themselves in a particular way and so on, and as if that is supposed to be some kind of symbolic victory for everyone. I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems to be that to point to resistance to this kind of professionalization, it seems to be that it's one of those things that it's so always already going on, it's almost invisible, in the sense that it seems to be, this is one of those points where it seems to me people are constantly resisting and creating new tactics of ways of dealing with it that aren't necessarily addressed as political. I mean, I think this is, I think one of the importance of the need to revitalize certain traditions of workers' inquiry, again, and in the sense that one of the things that workers' inquiry does is it not only finds out, what people are angry about and frustrated about and feeling alienated about, but it also in some sense finds out that, I mean, anyone who's had a job knows that at every job, people have ways of subverting the system, even if those ways aren't necessarily organized around anything other than getting a few more minutes of a break, getting a little bit of ability to blow off steam or whatever. I mean, those things always already exist, and in some sense, it's their invisibility that makes it so we can't, we feel ourselves trapped in a kind of moment of powerlessness, right? If we think that, like, you look around the world and you think that everyone but you is sort of docilely showing up and doing everything that's demanded of them, it's going to feel pretty powerless and alienating. And there's a need to, in some sense, intensify and mobilize these sort of everyday tactics into something that becomes more capable of connecting to larger forms of struggle.
So I think that's a fantastic question. And with all due respect, Jason, I think that the resistance to the language of the professional managerial class manifested itself on November 8th when Donald Trump was elected president. And we see all around the world a populist uprising against the professional managerial class. In 1976, Barbara and John Ehrenreich wrote about this class and its mediating position between the working class and the ruling class. And they were talking about how the new left seemed to be all professionals, and that the PMC was moving away from progressive, reformist solidarity to the working class and identifying itself as managers and gatekeepers to capital. So what we have done in the academic left is create a language, a professional language of activism, a professional language of progressivism, a professional language of affectual mutual management with regard to difference, and it's bullshit. And the people have rejected it. And part of the thing is that what we have to recover are not disorganized moments of sabotage, which is a long tradition. We have to create new forms of solidarity and have discipline and organization with regard to actually organizing the workplaces. But part of the thing is, I mean, I'm very negative and critical, and that's my activism at this point, because I'm old. It's up to you guys now. But this kind of awful, professionalized leftist rhetoric that permeates every single aspect of the progressive left, especially the Democratic Party, is all about affectual management, bias, policing. Why are we all working class people not into this? Why are working class people not into this language? Because it's a language of discipline, and it's a gatekeeping language, and it's a language that pretends that the distribution of wealth can take place through the adoption of a sort of kind of rhetoric of political correctness. So this is what I think was served up on November 8th for all of us.
Yeah, I'm going to try and tie all of this together around this piece of vocabulary, professionalization. So, yeah, of course, a communist politics entails a mass movement, right? But again, where is that mass movement, and why has it become, why is the sort of sense even if it's a fiction, even if it's false? Why is there this current historical sense that that potential or capacity has evaporated? Okay, so to go back to the problem of suturing various struggles together, this kind of paralysis that the contemporary seems to be suffering, where struggles are arriving at different times, I think professionalization is a prime symptom of a problem of multiple histories and multiple forms of uneven development. So the problem of professionalization is a crack down the center of feminisms. Okay? You have one kind of anti-capitalist feminism that is incredibly critical of this kind of liberal feminist sort of Hillary Clinton over professionalization that has sterilized all content, all struggle, all meaning, all significance, all historicity. On the other hand, you have a kind of modality of professionalism that is still a kind of feminist problematic, right? It's still about allowing various demographics that never had access to discipline, skill, tools, the means of production, the means of whatever, self-expression. And you have these currents that won't tie. I sympathize personally and on a emotional, affective level with what you're saying with all my heart. But from an analytical, historically slightly more objective point of view, it seems to be a problem of mutual, the misrecognition and the inability of, again, of struggles to see each other because of different historical conditions of emergence. So professionalization is the penultimate feminist aspiration for some, where now it's the #1 obstacle to be overcome in another kind of feminist politics. So but that's just more division, more separation. So yeah, a mass movement, but where are the symptoms, the signals? But thanks for that, gave us a focal point, a word.
Any other questions? Someone in the audience want to step up? Continue this discussion in this register, or would you rather break up into smaller groups and head home and keep talking? Thank you very much for this excellent discussion.